I'm just muted mine.
Hello, Joost.
Kitty, you can tell who's echoing by looking at
which
their
side
mouth.
do I have to look?
Did it work? Yeah.
Oh, hi Peter. Nice to meet you again.
Got my hand
Hi,
back.
Alex.
Yeah.
You can tell who's
Been a while.
echoing by looking at their mouth.
Yeah,
I haven't seen you
Amsterdam.
around here.
No,
Okay.
I went to this thing,
Yeah,
this
that's a
thing
good
one
way to
time
do it.
before to talk about MPP.
It's probably
Okay.
someone who
That was the only
is
time. So
echoing
now
at
I'm
and
going
was
to
just
sit
saying
in
that
the
we should look
audience.
at someone's mouth
It's
and
an
who's
interesting
moving when
subject.
they're
Yeah.
talking.
Yeah.
You were the first
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
So now you're up
Talking,
again.
testing, testing.
Okay, the F
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
they-
right.
was
No,
Udi was pretty for it, yeah.
You got your
Right.
Yeah, my fault.
Yeah,
Oh,
but
you
you're
think
quiet.
it was
Supposed to give a talk.
You're so quiet.
Yeah, but
Go say hi.
well, you you're at the first one.
I was watching on Twitter.
You were giving talk
No,
about
I mean,
what?
Yeah.
Right.
So
You're
management
cutting out,
again.
but
Like,
to me, you're
Oh,
cutting
no.
out.
coin selection 101. Udi, what are you doing in the
no,
floor?
it's not
Yeah,
echoing.
the only thing that I don't really like
And
about
Yeah,
this VR thing is
I
that
find it
it's
always
a
hard
lot
to
of conversation
explain
happening at the same time. It's kind of confusing.
I always
for
find it hard to explain coins.
So
to
yeah, I
anybody who
stayed
wants
up
to,
till
like,
3
dig
a.m.
deeper
last
into
night
like the details of how
playing
Hello.
it works.
Fantasy 5.
Yeah.
No, that's an adult. It's really hard to find like another.
Oddly, I can hear
Hello.
better
Yeah,
at
that's
these
an
than I
adult.
can in live.
Easy.
Can
you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay.
So I think the
Ah, Peter!
Yes.
Because before that,
Oh, how are you?
I finally
Are you the Dario I know?
But I usually speak to
Do I look like the Dario that you know?
What's that?
Yes, you
I've
do.
talked about the topic.
The movie Half-Baked?
These type of
Yes, I
slides,
am. I'm in near Zurich.
100 and
I think
Cool.
it's
I'm very
98,
nice.
maybe.
Our thing's there.
Animations make stuff easier to
But
explain,
anyways, it was
this is too funny.
and
And where are you in real life? Are you still in California?
Yeah.
SNES 9X on
Juice,
my
did you just
Linux.
mute
And-
yourself?
I don't know.
You're surviving the
No, so
And
there's
second,
a thing now. There's a thing
the
called
Corona
Workshop
stay at home
Okay,
very well?
Check it
Just
out.
FYI, you have a
We're
little
doing
bit
it
of
on
static on your mic. It's
and
not.
it's this
terrible,
thing
but-
called
I'll do it
charity,
again next month.
Oh, maybe I should.
where
Yeah, it's been a while.
Not
And,
play,
so far so good.
the, Final
Yeah,
Fantasy
it is. Whatever you did. That.
Oh,
Good, that's very
It's
good.
back now.
with
Pleasure.
the-
It's
kinda like
really
white
funny,
noise.
actually.
So, like,
It's funny to see you
my
here,
favorite
and it's great to
Maybe I should try.
And only
join
played
in.
four
I missed
classes,
the past few,
and they
I will
always
try
have
another
like,
one.
but I thought I'd come
as soon as they
to watch a little bit about privacy today.
so like
Mhm.
I now have a berserker, a ranger.
Are you here alone?
A
That's a
in the
strange
month.
question.
Okay.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
I have a feeling we're getting muted
Yes.
Yeah.
At least in
you
Zurich,
know, Final
sometimes they
Hey,
talk
that's just
about.
the Dario I know as well.
Basically, I guess
Hey, Dario.
my like all-time favorite.
Johnny,
game.
any
I've
last
played
words?
it so many times.
Angie,
It's nice.
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
played it for many, many years.
What way are you gonna
How's
sit?
it going?
It's really fun
Should I
to
sit
play
next
it
to you?
again.
very well, thank you. Yeah, How are you?
Yeah, good, good. Thanks. I just thought I'd say hi.
I'll take the opposite.
My old Sega Genesis games.
Oh,
and
that's
all
fine.
my
We
Nintendo
always
64
take the odds
games.
against Is this-
So fun to just go back and play them. Even if it's just for a few minutes, you know, to get back into the
Okay, we're ready to start. Andrew, you're still talking, but no one else can talk to you, so. But that's fine. Yeah, no problem. Okay, so welcome again to another Reckless VR Meetup. It's really awesome to see you. I hope you're having a great weekend. Those of you who are just starting it, and those of you who are in Europe in the middle of it. If you're new here, then yeah, we have Reckless VR Meetups every weekend, and you can join us through recklessvr.com and sign up, and you'll get invites every week into your mailbox, or you can follow us on Twitter. It's reckless_VR. And yeah, you should definitely join. This is super cool, and you don't have to use a VR headset. So even if you don't have a VR headset, you can join with your PC. So I would give it a shot. Yeah, and before we continue, I want to say a word from our sponsor, Kraken, which is helping us support those weekly meetups. So Kraken is the best exchange in the world for buying and selling Bitcoin. It has the tightest security and deep liquidity and a great fee structure with no minimums or hidden fees. And whether you're looking for a simple fiat on-ramp or futures trading, Kraken is the place for you. So really thanks, Kraken, for supporting us. And well, today we're joined by Waxwing, also known as Adam Gibson. You guys might know him because he's with us from the very start. He was the first presenter on on Reckless VR before it was called Reckless VR, actually. And he's also a maintainer for JoinMarket, which is a CoinJoin implementation, and he's a pretty big privacy advocate and Beat Saber aficionado. So, yeah. So that's Adam. And I guess, Adam, to kind of start, I used to follow you on Twitter, but then you deleted your Twitter account recently. Is that true?
Yeah, but what's maybe more interesting is when did I stop using Twitter, Udi?
When was it? When did you stop using it? Probably when I signed up. I don't know when you stopped using it.
When did you sign up? Maybe that's true. I don't know. When did you sign up?
Yeah, it was a lot of years ago.
Many years ago, yeah. I signed up many years ago to Twitter, but it's really difficult to remember. I think it might have been 2012, and I signed up to it because I thought, well, there's all these people there's like funny jokes coming out of it. I honestly just thought it was kind of funny. So I signed up to it, but I didn't use it until maybe, I don't know, early 2017, pretty late. Actually started like posting things there. And I mean, even at the time, I mean, you got to understand, I'm somebody who never ever used Facebook in my entire life.
You never even signed up?
No, I really didn't.
Wow.
I know it's strange. I mean, yeah, it is strange, but I really dislike that kind of format of thing. So I was kind of reluctant to use Twitter, but I did use it for a while, and I got quite active on there, I think in 2017, 2018. But I stopped using it like mid 2018. But it was very interesting that people just continued to reference it as if that was my central like point of contact on the internet, even though I hadn't used it for like a year and a half. And then why did I stop using it? It's because, I mean, I just generally don't like corporate social media. I think it's a bad model. And I think what we've got right now is a kind of a public square, which is effectively Twitter. And for all that you can make the perfectly reasonable argument that any private platform has the right to, control any messages on it, and that's true. The fact that it's become this de facto, if not de jure, public square, I think is extremely disturbing. And the people who like make decisions about what kind of messages are allowed and not allowed on there are, as far as I'm concerned, a bunch of idiots, probably in San Francisco. No offense to San Francisco, but and it's just a bunch of effectively children. They're probably not by age children, but by mentality they certainly are. So I want absolutely nothing to do with it, and quite frankly, I think all of you should immediately delete your accounts. The only reason I actually deleted my account is because people kept actually referring to my Twitter handle. I think I actually increased the number of followers in the year and a half since I've actually posted anything on that platform, which just tells you that it's all a lot of fake nonsense. And there's also the whole sort of tribalism thing. I don't like the way people act in big groups. It really gets on my nerves. And I have found ever since I started on the internet way back, in the 90s, it's when the communities are smaller and a bit more anarchic. That's when I kind of enjoy it. And when it gets bigger and it gets more serious, and then you sort of see the herd behavior, and you see all the companies coming in, I just have to kind of run away, And those other elements of the internet, they still exist, I mean, we don't have Usenet anymore, but we have these smaller like IRC or what have you, these little groups, little fractured communities that I think they're still kind of fun to be in, but something like Twitter is just horrible, and I think it's kind of slightly unethical to even take part in it. But that's a very debatable point, I admit. So
I mean, people are watching you on Twitter right now, so I don't know if you considered that. But yeah. It's I get where you're coming from. So you kind of moved to Mastodon, right?
Well, only in the sense that I found that the whole thing of like micro-blogging, I think a lot of people probably think it's kind of silly, but this idea of just like writing little messages about what you're doing at the moment, I actually kind of like that aspect of Twitter quite a lot. So, I mean, when you first hear about Twitter back in the day, a lot of people, including myself, thought it was kind of silly, like 140 characters. I mean, what's the point of that? It just seemed pointless. But actually, there is something to that model. So while I only write a blog post on my actual blog, like 4 or 5 times a year, if that, just like jotting off a quick note in public, I actually see some value in that because it gives me a reference point. I can refer people and say, oh, look, this is what I'm thinking about that issue. So, I mean, the fact that platform doesn't have so many users is, to me, not as much of a huge deal. It's just the fact that there's a micro-blogging function there. But I also
Right.
do think that it would be great if more people use that kind of system where it's federated and where people can have like smaller communities that they all agree on their rules, and then they can make bridges across those communities, and it's all open source. It's just, to me, it's like a no-brainer that that's the right model, really. Yeah.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So you can. How can I find you on Mastodon, by the way?
I'm
not that
on
easy.
Vladimir. Okay, right. I'm on Vladimir van der Laan's server, which is x0f.org. So it's a nice short URL, x0f.org, and my username is waxwing. Just as
So
it
it's
is
waxwing at
here, isn't it?
xof.org. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. So okay, so maybe I don't know how many people here are familiar with JoinMarket. So maybe you could tell us a bit about it.
Sure, yeah. So quick summary of JoinMarket. So basically, I probably don't have to explain the concept of CoinJoin to people here, but if I did have to, it would be just multiple people cooperating to build a Bitcoin transaction so that all of their different inputs go in, and they also decide what outputs they get out of the transaction. And because of the way Bitcoin signing works, it's trustless. So even if you're, like building a transaction with me and you're expecting to get 10 Bitcoins coming out to address A, you don't have to worry that I'm going to somehow diddle with the transaction and then your money won't appear, because everything gets signed and sort of controlled like that. So why would people do a coin join? Well, the simplest reason, at least the reason that's existed thus far, is that by doing a coin join, you make it, it's not exactly that you make your transaction private, because your transaction is still there. Like there's your inputs on the input side and there's your outputs on the output side. But you can do certain things that make it really unobvious, or maybe even impossible to tell which output corresponds to which inputs. So one obvious technique that is the principal one that's been used up till now is to make some of the outputs in the transaction exactly the same amount. So that's usually what we see in a coin join nowadays, which is we see multiples outputs of exactly the same denomination, such as 1.24 BTC. So you might see like 6 outputs of 1.24 BTC, or you might see 50 outputs of 1.24 BTC. And so the idea there is that those outputs are kind of, in a sense, fundamentally indistinguishable. You can't figure out which of the various, even if you know a lot about the input side, even if you knew all the names and addresses of all the people who put in the inputs to the transaction, it wouldn't be obvious, at least, or it wouldn't be possible to tell, at least from that specific transaction, who owns which output of those equal ones. Now, that's a very quick summary of CoinJoin. We'll have more to say about it later, I think. But JoinMarket is an idea that Chris Belcher had in late 2014. And like a lot of ideas, I think if you really examine history, you might find one or two other people had a very similar idea around the same time. But Chris Belcher really sort of said, I'm going to do this, which is to make a system that does coin joins, but addresses a problem of denominations. So the problem with what I just described with a 1.24 BTC is everyone's got to agree to create a 1.24 BTC output, which might be very suitable or appropriate for one particular person, but good luck finding 10 other people who also want to pay exactly 1.24 BTC, right? That's difficult. So Chris Belcher's idea was, well, you can solve that problem with a market, because you can say that, okay, not everyone is coordinating and not everyone will naturally coordinate and want to do the same amount at the same time. But if there's some market incentive where some participants are paid a small amount, are paid a fee effectively, then they'll be prepared to wait and be prepared to offer to take part in such a coin join when actually only one person really wants that specific coin join at that time. So that's why I came up with the name JoinMarket, because we were like, well, what should this be called? I thought, the obvious name, right? JoinMarket, right? It's a coin join, but it's a market. So we came up with the name. Chris Belcher wrote the initial version of the code, as I say, maybe December 2014, and then we sort of went live around mid-2015, where we were already doing coin joins, very similar to the ones you'll see today, with, it's usually anything between 3 and 15 different participants in any one coin join. Nowadays, kind of 9 is supposed to be the default, but whether it actually is debatable. And so we do coins like that. It's an open source project. It's written in Python. We use, like, for example, libsecp to 56k1 as a binding to that from Python for our Bitcoin operations. And what else can we say about the software? The software needs Bitcoin Core to sort of manage the wallet. It would be nice if we had another option. Something that's often been a point of tension and debate is like, we want, for example, we started off using connections to an API of a blockchain explorer, but this was like horribly kind of non-private. So we kind of said to ourselves, no, we should just stick with Bitcoin Core for now. We did sort of play around with using Electrum servers as well, but there's also privacy issues if you use public ones of those. So Bitcoin Core, maybe in the future we might use, client-side filtering or something. What else about the project itself? I mean, I could just witter on, but what natural questions arise about the project?
So, like, I guess a difference between JoinMarket and, let's say, Wasabi and Samurai and the other newer ones is basically the market thing, right? So instead of
the main one,
that's so like when you use JoinMarket, you're either gonna offer coin joins or you're gonna take them yourself, and which is
the two roles. Good point. Yeah, so essentially what you should think of it is like this. When you look at something like Wasabi, you've got a central coordinating server. And cryptography is used to make sure that you don't just leak all your privacy to the server. You don't actually tell the server which coins, which outputs are linked to which inputs. So with that coordination, there's sort of, if you think about it, there's multiple aspects of coordination. There's coordination in time. So they're going to say, right, we're going to do a coin join at a specific time, or maybe there's a timeout and they'll do it before that time, whatever. But there's some kind of timing coordination. Then there's amount coordination, at least before we start talking about wabi-sabi, which is another whole can of worms. Right now they have, just as I was describing at the start, an equal sized amount, an equal amount output for each participant. So if there's 50 participants in a Wasabi coin join, they'll all be getting one output, which is an exactly the same amount. And people here in the audience, or you might correct me, at one point they were using 0.05, and then they were using 0.1, and then now I think they're using multiple different specific
I think you're right.
output amounts. Am I right? Yeah. But in any case, what's clearly the case is that they have to sort of, at a global, in quotes, consensus level, decide what those output sizes are. So everyone who's using Wasabi to do coin joins has to agree, okay, I'm going to use, let's say, 0.1 BTC as my outputs for my coin join rounds, or whatever other amount it is. So they have to coordinate like that. So what the way in which JoinMarket is quite radically different is that whole idea that the coordinator is actually one of the participants in the coin join instead. So the coordinator is the person who comes along and says to everyone else waiting, says, I want a coin join of exactly this amount, and it can be down to the last Satoshi. And everyone else who is offering to do coin joins in that range, so if I want 1.234 BTC, or 1.24 BTC is what I said before, then maybe I can choose from 20 or 30 people, it's probably even more than that at the moment, who would have offered to do a coin join within a range that falls in. So for example, one participant, we call them makers, may be sitting there making an offer saying, I will do coin joins from 0.1 up to 2.5 BTC. And so if I come along and say, I want to do a coin join of 1.24, he may well be prepared to say, yes, I will do that. And I can find, let's say, 9 other people who will say, yes, I'm prepared to do that. And the point, of course, is that I'm going to pay them a small fee. And perhaps more significantly in reality nowadays, it's debatable, is I'm going to pay the whole Bitcoin network fee. And the Bitcoin network transaction fee of a coin join is multiple times larger than the Bitcoin network transaction fee of an ordinary payment, because of course it has n times the number of inputs and n times the number of outputs, roughly. So overall, what's my incentive if I'm coming in to do that is that I get to be the coordinator. I get to decide the amount. I get to decide when I'm going to do it, and I can just log in, not log in, I can turn on the software, do it, and then walk away. Everyone else has to sit around waiting, and everyone else doesn't get to be the coordinator, so they don't get the privacy against me personally as the taker, because I know all the linkages in that one transaction, and they don't know any of the other linkages themselves. So it's kind of complicated, but sorry. You know.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I mean, you get like one person who gets to choose the size that they want, and you get to choose like basically everything, the timing and the size.
Yeah.
And as opposed to with something like Wasabi and Samurai, where you have to wait until everyone gathers around and pick some amount together. Yeah, it makes sense. So let's maybe to kind of look at, I guess, what it looks like practically. I mean, one thing I'm interested in is, and I know you're really interested in it too, is how, you know, how people actually use those tools and what kind of mistakes they can do. And just a few days ago, you published a blog post on the GridChain case. GridChain was a user, right, that I think in 2017 said that he lost some funds. Some, yeah.
Some.
Was it like 400 BTC, right? Yeah, that's
445. Yeah.
400. That's a substantial amount. And then someone published a report just recently about it.
So Ergo BTC, who was working for OXT researchers. I don't exactly know the kind of connections there, but I certainly know that those guys were involved. So the report's very interesting reading. It is like they require you to provide an email address to read the full report. But in any case, there is a summary there if you just want to briefly skim like the overall ideas. So this case is interesting because I think the point you're trying to sort of lead into there is you're trying to point out that there are a lot of ways that you can really screw up if you're using these kinds of systems. Yeah. And so this report and then my follow-on blog post nicely, I think, illustrates many potential pitfalls or what do we call, as programmers call them, foot guns, you know, things that you can shoot yourself in the foot with very easily when using these kinds of systems. All right. So to summarize without going into excruciating detail, if you want the excruciating detail, my blog post does go into that as they all do. It's on joinmarket.me/blog and you can look at that. But anyway, so what is this case? Well, the guy turns up on Reddit in 2017 saying that he was hacked in 2015 and 445 BTC in two clumps, essentially, one of which is 400 BTC, were stolen from his site or whatever it was. I don't really know. And the coins kind of sat there for 2 years. And then what happened in 2017 is that they started moving and they started going through multiple coin joins. And when he pointed it out on Reddit, myself and several other people said, oh, look, that's definitely JoinMarket. Or at least if it isn't JoinMarket, it's someone trying really, really hard to make it look like JoinMarket because the pattern of the coin joins. But this turns out to be a very relevant point to coin join generally, is that until we start talking about pay join later, coin joins are a very kind of transparent privacy protocol, if that isn't too much of a contradiction in terms, because when you look at them on the blockchain, they have a very specific kind of footprint. They we already said multiple equal outputs, although there's more to it than that. Yeah, we looked at it. It was obviously JoinMarket. Yeah, at least the ones we're talking about today are very obvious. It might. There's some gray areas, you know. You can have like three-party coin joins and you don't really know if they're a coin join. You can have fake coin joins, and that's not even just like a sort of joke point, because, for example, Samurai has that built in as one of their features, literally fake coin joins. So there are gray areas, but generally speaking, coin joins are very obvious as such. So we looked at this and we said, yeah, that's JoinMarket, and we could kind of trace through in a very kind of casual way. I could see multiple rounds of taking that maker role that we just earlier discussed. In other words, this guy, let's call him a thief, or we don't actually know exactly who this actor is, whether, you know, it could be an inside job or something, I don't know. But let's call it the thief. So the thief has basically run the maker side of JoinMarket, where he's sitting there waiting over fairly long periods and just a small amounts, you know, out of 400, maybe at one time 5.6 BTC get coin joined out, and then, you know, a few days later or a week later, 2.7 gets coin joined out. And this happens multiple times, maybe 10, 11 times. But then it starts to get more complicated to try and trace forward what's going on. So what happened in just recently was Ergo BTC's analysis, and I would recommend Now help me out, Udi. The podcast, was it Stefan Livera? I think it was. Recently
yeah.
he did a podcast which will help you if, either you're not going to read the report or it's too technical for you. He'll go into some detail on that podcast as well, which I think is quite interesting, where he describes how by using the OXT Research's like blockchain analysis tool, he was able to like really go into a lot more detail what actually happened with these coins. And yeah, I've got to try and avoid going into too much detail here, right? So basically, what's like the upshot of all the analysis? What's the findings, right? So the findings are that he faced several problems in doing this. First of all, he had a very large size. Let's just say he had one clump of 400 Bitcoins and he's moving it into JoinMarket. And typically at the time then, and still today, I think it's roughly the same, we have maybe 100 people kind of hanging around waiting to do a coin join on JoinMarket. Of those 100, probably 85 to 90 are going to have amounts to offer to coin join less than, let's say, 10 Bitcoins, maybe 50, I don't know. I'm just pulling these numbers out of the air, but you get the general idea. Of course, most people are not super rich or they're not rich enough that they're prepared to put like 100 BTC into something like JoinMarket, a hot wallet just offering to do transactions at any time. There's a significant risk factor in there. Even if the code was like literally the best code in the world, that in its nature is quite a high security bar, isn't it? So it's quite natural that people will tend to offer lower amounts, although there'll be the people here and there who'll offer higher amounts. So the problem this guy had was he throws his coins into JoinMarket and he sees small amounts of it peeling off over time into coin joins, but he's a bit impatient. I mean, I don't know if he was a thief, but if he's a thief, then thieves are often impatient and he needs to get the money somewhere else. So then what he starts doing is making very large coin joins, 25 BTC, 56 BTC. And in doing this, he gets the coin joins which don't have 9 people taking part. They have maybe only 3 people or 4 people taking part. Now, I don't know how technical this person was, but if they'd seen that, they probably should have started worrying a little bit. But that's not the end of the story. So he does multiple coin joins like that, maybe 4, 5, 6 coin joins like that, very large size, but small numbers of counterparties. And this is where Ergo BTC sort of had a light bulb moment because he said, look, this is a low anonymity set. So if I can attack it a little bit, I might be able to really reduce this anonymity set. And what he realized is, for a technical reason I don't want to get into here, read the blog post because I really drew a diagram and everything. For a technical reason, there's actually cases where the anonymity set of 3 or 4 can be reduced to 2 or even 1. And of course, when it's reduced to 1, it's essentially de-anonymized. Yeah. Now, in that particular case, when it was reduced to 1, well, that output just went into another coin join anyway. So it wasn't the end of the world, or it could have been. But then there was another case where it was reduced to 2, and he followed one of the 2 outputs, and it ended up after 3 or 4 hops in Poloniex. And because Poloniex clusters are identified, at least on their blockchain analysis tool OXT, he said, look at this. This is a deposit into Poloniex. Now, I don't know for sure that that's the guy with the 400, right? But it's a possibility, right? So he looks at that possibility and he sees that deposit address has multiple large deposits to it. In fact, the total that was deposited onto that single address, so address reuse, on that single address is 270 Bitcoins. Now, when he traces back those other deposits, he can see other connections and other sort of not perfect deductions, but very plausible deductions he can make about those connections back to the JoinMarket cluster. And so consequently, it's the right way to look at it is what we have is a sort of combination of evidence, any one part of which might not be completely determine the outcome, but which is very overwhelming. And even if it's not completely 100%, it gives you such a strong lead that if you were law enforcement, let's say, well, that's what you need, right? You don't need a 95% lead. You need maybe a 50% lead. 1% is no good because it'll take you too long, right? But what he's got there is a set of leads that are very, very strong fingerprints. And if we sort of break it down, we see essentially 3 problems that the thief person had. First, large amount going into a pool of mixing which doesn't really support it. Second problem is using low anonymity set coin joins in the mix. And the third problem is probably the most serious one is reuse of a deposit address and exchange, heavy reuse, like, 270 Bitcoins across multiple transactions.
Yeah.
So all those three things together ended up being enough that, and we're not going to say like, oh, the whole thing is exactly untangled. No, it isn't at all. But a huge chunk of it is very, very likely to have ended up at that destination.
Yeah. And it's probably at a point that, law enforcement can just approach Poloniex and ask for the details of that person, and they're basically done.
Well, but that's the interesting point, isn't it? Because I was asking somebody on IRC the other day, because this is the kind of thing that gets lost in history. But do you remember with Poloniex, there was a whole story where originally you could open accounts with just an email?
Oh yeah.
And I think Poloniex, a lot of its success was from that.
Yeah, for sure.
But at some point, things changed, didn't it? Do you remember the details? At some point, it changed where, oh no, that's not possible anymore. And they restricted how much you could withdraw according to what level of account you were. And then they stopped allowing email accounts altogether, and they required ID.
Yeah.
I don't remember the detail, like the timing of it,
They finally disabled like non-KYC accounts around 2017. That was like the final straw when they were purchased by a US-based company.
But was that like in the middle of 2017?
I don't know.
Because the reason
it's very specific.
The
I'm not
reason
sure.
I asked.
Yeah.
No, but I know it's specific, and the reason I ask is because this activity we're describing of this thief happens during 2017, and the biggest chunks of it happen at the end of 2017. It's kind of interesting.
Right. So they
I
also
don't know the
waited
details,
from
obviously.
2015 to 2017 just to move the coins, right? Which is kind of amazing.
Which is also interesting. Yeah, that is very interesting. I don't know what happened there.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting case. I think that that point about address reuse is so easy to mess up in so many ways. I mean, I know I've seen a lot of posts by people on, the Wasabi Reddit and places like that, where they say, okay, I mixed my coins. It took me a long time. I'm done. And then I took them and I sent them to my hardware wallet together in one transaction, which is, I mean, it's not necessarily the end of the world, because maybe you still don't, but it's probably, you're going to have now the exact amount that you started with, which is pretty bad. And you're going to mix all of those coin joins together, which is pretty bad. So you really have to know what you're doing, it seems like.
Well, yeah, but a lot of it is about your threat model too. Don't forget, like, I remember in the Reddit post, which kicked this all off in 2017, one of my comments was like, please, don't consider JoinMarket like a defense against the NSA sort of thing. It's not that high a level of a obfuscating tool. But if you take, for example, the maker side of JoinMarket, it's kind of a low level, very slow improvement in your privacy over time, or avoiding degrading your privacy over time, let's say. It's not that kind of thing. Whereas the taker side of JoinMarket is a more active attempt to improve privacy, but you still, very concretely, this is something I really emphasize in this blog post, is with the taker side of JoinMarket, you get to do one thing that you can't do anywhere else with CoinJoin, which is that you can take a meaningful chunk of coins and mix them with no unmixed change, because you can choose the exact amount. We call that a sweep transaction. And that's a very fundamental way in which the taker side is different from the maker side. But having said that, none of that really changes your general fundamental point, which is that it's very easy to screw this up, and especially if you have a kind of serious threat model. In other words, where you have, it doesn't have to be like law enforcement. If someone's targeting you and trying to analyze you and really collating documents on you and everything, when they look at the blockchain, you've got a seriously difficult task ahead of you if we're going to try and be really sure that your coin process, so to speak, cannot be traced by that person who's using all kinds of metadata, not just exchange. Am I still here?
Yep.
Okay, I lost tracking on one of my hands. So my hand is just going to stay there. Yeah, somebody's attacking you. Somebody's attacking you, and got all the different metadata, the exchanges, the network level metadata, the timing analysis, and the blockchain graph. Good luck. It's very, very hard.
Right. Yeah, it is hard. But you can see some examples of, especially when you start mixing together UTXOs that that they're supposed to stay separate after mixing. Like if you take two different mixes and you put them back together, then especially if we're talking large amounts, you can sometimes kind of learn a lot very easily. And it seems like it really requires not just JoinMarket, any CoinJoin based system really requires the users to, you know, really understand it. They really have to know how it works. You can't just click a button and
I mean, somewhat. Let's not overstate that, right? Because if you take JoinMarket as an example, we have this kind of multiple accounts separation, and the purpose of it is not just to give you multiple accounts, which is cool and everything, but the purpose of it is specifically to avoid the scenario where you take the output of a coin join and you combine it with the change from that same coin join or a linked coin join. You don't want to do that. Because think of the 5 accounts as 5 like wallet clusters, and what you want to do is make sure that if you move between the accounts or the wallet clusters, you do so only via a coin join with, you know, with a hopefully big enough anonymity set. And of course, you will see similar measures taken, and I think it's a bit different in Wasabi and in Samurai's tool set, where they have this concept of zero link, and they have various kinds of specific rules about how they construct, you know, wallets. It could be labeling, it could be accounts, it could be, you know, there's multiple ways to approach it, but you can give users features that at least prevent them from, you know, shooting themselves in the foot from a trivial behavior. But, you know, it's still the case that over time, I mean, because no matter how clever you are with your wallet, they're going to move it somewhere else, and then they're going to do something else with that other wallet. And, you know, they do have to be conscious of what they're doing, unfortunately. Yeah.
I mean, I know that when I talk with like non-technical people, they say, well, I want an app, I click a button and it makes my funds private. If I need to wait, I'll wait. But then I just want to use it, which is, I don't think we're there really. I mean, we're close to there. We have to, I mean, if you're involved enough to understand those concepts of having separate wallets and maybe labeling and whatever, then I guess you could do it. But you have to be involved enough, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess we'll come on to this shortly, but this comes to that deeper point about the difference between a consumer payments technology and more like a kind of, I don't know, an industrial payments technology, because to me, Bitcoin is the latter and something like Lightning is the former. And the former, just as Richard Stallman correctly pointed out when he analyzed Bitcoin, he said, you know, the most important thing to me is that the consumer gets privacy. I don't necessarily want the businesses and the corporations to get privacy. And the consumer payments privacy, I think, naturally comes out of moving out of the base chain. Perhaps we will talk about that in a moment.
Yeah. Maybe. Okay. So would you say
my hand really is going to stay here the whole rest of the time? I'm sorry. I mean, honestly,
maybe you can click some button.
This one's fine. No, I really.
Well, it seems like an extension.
Let's not think about it.
Yeah. At least it's not in front of your face like this. Then it would be pretty lame.
Sorry about this.
Yeah. So, okay. I think one thing that we didn't really discuss is confidential transactions. So for people who don't know that, confidential transactions are, well, basically they're a proposal for a way to hide amounts in transactions. And they're implemented in things like Liquid and also in other coins like Monero and Mimblewimble and maybe other things. But it's not implemented in Bitcoin itself. Although I think there was like kind of the original context for it, but it's definitely not implemented in Bitcoin itself. So I was wondering there are like questions around it, like if you're hiding amounts, that kind of reduces your ability to audit the total like number of coins in existence, and the cryptography is supposed to protect that, but cryptography is not perfect. Maybe it's broken. So do you think that this is something that might make its way into Bitcoin one day, or maybe not so likely?
Yeah, obviously it's an open question. My feeling is probably not, unless something changes in a very kind of profound way. I was trying to think about an analogy for this, because first of all, I would say that myself, and certainly not only myself, back in 2018, after confidential transactions was even a year or two before that, as an idea, and people had really looked into it and started writing code and stuff. But even in 2017, 18, there was a sense developing that while it's very obvious that it provides huge advantages, but the thing about hiding something very deep, like some aspect of the public consensus behind what's effectively an encryption. Think of it crudely as we're encrypting the amounts, right? I have a feeling that's always going to be quite problematic. See, on the one hand, people will say, well, don't be silly, because we already have cryptographic assumptions in Bitcoin, right? We have to assume that ECDSA, for example, actually works, that it does what it says it does, right? That nobody else can just sign transactions off my coins and effectively steal them. So we do make cryptographic assumptions. We don't make too many. Arguably, I suppose the other one is the hash function, but the main one is ECDSA. The ECDSA is the cryptographic signing algorithm we use in Bitcoin to sign transactions. So you could say it's kind of silly to worry about cryptography. We've already got cryptography. And it's not just that the cryptographic assumptions of confidential transactions are stronger assumptions. In fact, they're not stronger assumptions. It's essentially the same assumption, right? The assumption is the ECDLP is not breakable in a non-trivial time, in a trivial time. But what was I trying to say? Yeah, but my feeling at that time, and I haven't really changed my mind, was that there's something a bit deeper going on. That imagine this analogy. Imagine everyone in the town, all the locks on their houses suddenly stop working, and everyone could just go around and steal everyone else's stuff. Let's say, concretely, everyone's stealing everyone else's TVs, right? It's a disaster. It's a complete, it's not anarchy in the nice sense. It's anarchy in the worst sense, right? Everyone's stealing everyone's TVs.
It's not great, yeah.
It's a terrible situation. It's a terrible situation, but we could resolve it by enacting some, I don't know, violent measures, police, what have you, and then just building new locks that actually do lock the houses properly, right? But it's a fundamentally different thing if somebody in the town suddenly invented a machine that could create an infinite number of televisions. It would, or infinite number of any other consumer goods. It would be that's a fundamentally different kind of break. That's like a break in reality. Because if you could start printing arbitrary stuff, to me that's a much worse outcome. And the worst thing is if he could print, I don't know, TVs, furniture, whatever, any kind of consumer goods. He could just click his fingers and create millions of them. And nobody would even know. That doesn't really fit the analogy now, because people would see, right? They would see all this stuff around he's creating. But if nobody could even see it, then it would just be, we can't live in a world like that, right? So the difference between making a cryptographic hardness assumption and an assumption of well-written cryptographic papers with good security proofs, and an assumption of a well-written protocol, and an assumption of well-written code implementation of that protocol, is that if it's for something that, if it fails, the disaster vector is so extreme and not visible, then that's not really acceptable. And I was worrying about that in mid-2018, and I think it was the end of 2018 when Zcash said, oh yeah, by the way, that happened for a whole year. That we had a system where the essential promise that the system was making was violated for a whole year without anyone knowing about it. So, it's easy to hate on Zcash in a Bitcoin meeting. So Bitcoin, Zcash is shit, whatever. But that's not what I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to get at there's something deep here that I think that there's a subtle but vital difference between the cryptographic assumptions we make at a kind of peer-to-peer transacting level. Because notice this, right? If ECDSA was broken, in such a way that I could sign for Udi's keys without Udi even like giving me his keys. I could just like take all his coins. If I could do that, it would be terrible for Udi. But to the Bitcoin network, all they're doing is just like verifying. So they see valid signature, verified, make a state transition, valid signature, verified, make a state transition. That's all they're doing. They're just transitioning the state step by step, and they're all agreeing on what it is. Now, it just so happens I've effectively stolen his key. Effectively, the lock on his door is bust, right? But that's terrible, and we would have to. It might be completely the end of Bitcoin, but if not, we would kind of rebuild the system, but based on maybe an earlier state before that happened, right. For example, might happen, right? But if we start messing around with the consensus layer, like how many coins there are, right? And nobody can see that it's been messed around with, then to me that's just like.
We won't even know.
I've gone on too long, but you get the idea is pretty clear. I think a lot of people already understand the same principle. I mean, does it mean that there will definitely not be CT? I don't know. I think probably not, but we'll see.
Yeah. So I mean,
it's just my intuition.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that the thing of not knowing is to me pretty scary. You don't know if it's maybe going on for a very long time. If someone's going to steal other people's coins, people will likely notice pretty early, right? But if it's just printing new coins and you can't see that, then who knows how long that could go on for? And you never know for sure.
Notice how that line of reasoning. Yeah, you never know. And notice how that line of reasoning, never know, is specific to the concept of encrypting states, right? Because we're talking about a system whose intrinsic nature is public verifiability. So it doesn't mean that you can't encrypt anything in it, but it means that you've got to really seriously think twice about encrypting anything. Now, with something like Zcash, it goes further, but it's a bit, but it's essentially the same kind of thing, because they don't just encrypt the amount, they encrypt the transaction graph. And the way they do that, one way of looking at it is that they sort of, encrypt the transaction graph so that the double spend rule doesn't get violated. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin with Bitcoin. One of them is like, make sure the total doesn't get violated. And the other side of the coin is make sure you don't double spend. Because what's so weird and strange about digital cash is that your first thought about digital cash is that's a damn stupid idea because I can copy data infinitely, right? So the solving of the double spend problem, in Bitcoin's case, you have a complete network picture, so you know every point where every coin transfer is, right? So Zcash is actually going as far as encrypting that, which is obviously a much more advanced piece of cryptography, but it's the same basic principle, because you don't know if they failed in following that. The verification is like a step up. It's a layer above. It's on this cryptographically blinded level. That's where the verification happens. But it's very, very difficult to stomach that, to have verification that isn't absolutely on the base layer with zero assumptions.
Right. Right, and that happens with, I mean, I guess most of the privacy coins try to hide amounts in some way. Like I guess Monero and Mabel will do that with confidential transactions, and as you said, Zcash does something that's even more involved. And so, I guess it sounds to me like your point of view is that maybe Bitcoin needs to be a lot more basic on the lower level. Is that, or that's how you would think about it? Am I reading you correctly?
Yeah, I see it as more like a kind of very heavy industrial layer. And what our goal in trying to be more private and just trying to make Bitcoin more usable should be more, I sometimes use the phrase back in the day, I used to say, take the semantics off chain. So in other words, obviously, Bitcoin has its own simple semantics of that. The meaning is that there isn't really a meaning so much of it. You have inputs and you have outputs, and each transaction authorizes moving, or let's say destroying the old coins and making a new set of coins in these new outputs, just according to a simple set of rules that, the total can't be bigger than before. Basically, it's about as simple as it gets. But what we actually want to do as people is make much more complicated. Much more meaningful transactions, like, I want to pay you at a certain time, I want to pay you on a schedule, I want to do all kinds of things, right? I want to pay with time locks, I want to have a wallet that has some covenant thing, whatever, so all that semantics, all that weird stuff, we want to move it off chain, because if we can, whatever we can move off chain, it's going to solve scalability and privacy. It'll cut the Gordian knot, so to speak. Because one of the first arguments we used to have about confidential transactions, for example, back in 2016, it was that we were all wringing our hands about size, because the first version proposed had these very large zero-knowledge range proofs.
Right.
I seem to remember like 4 kilobytes. I can't remember exactly how many kilobytes, but per output even. It was just absolutely huge. So we were all wringing our hands because we were saying we really want to have like blinded amounts, because things like CoinJoin would work perfectly with blinded amounts. But we can't stomach this amount of size being taken up on the chain. So, if you can try to move the semantics off chain, then you don't have to trade off between scalability and privacy. Privacy is sometimes achieved through noise. Don't forget, that's true in many privacy systems. A good example is mixnets. Mixnets are these really weird systems, but they're so brilliant, where you have like n people, and every one of the n people sends out a message every time one of them wants to speak. So the purpose of it is to make it essentially information theoretically impossible to distinguish the message, because every single participant has done the same thing. So that's a perfect example of this problem of you're trying to create privacy by sort of artificially creating this bigger crowd of stuff to look at. But that doesn't suit a blockchain, right? That's not really what it does.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like you're probably more like hopeful for things like Lightning. I think you mentioned before that you're thinking that for like payments, for actual consumer payments, would probably be better off doing something else completely, right?
Yeah. You mean different than Lightning, or including Lightning?
I mean, including Lightning. I mean, something different completely than Bitcoin base layer transactions. Yeah.
Right. I mean, somewhat. Yeah. So basically, every time we have these discussions, I always try to say to people, don't just think about Lightning. There are plenty of other ideas out there. I mean, it can anything from like Ruben Somson's state chains ideas. There's recent discussion about CoinSwap. Well, that's kind of an old topic, but it's kind of somewhat connected to Lightning, but not quite the same thing. But it also has that property that it's off-chain, in the sense that you're doing transactions where the actual semantics are off-chain, because I'm paying you, actually Alex was paying you and I was paying someone else. So that's very similar to Lightning. Lightning is just a lot more developed version of the same idea, with this whole extra layer of punishment, and therefore you can net. Anyway, so yeah, I think Lightning works as a consumer payment. And people who haven't thought about this, I think most people probably have by now, but just think about simple things that make Lightning work as a consumer payment in an ideal world, admittedly, maybe not today, compared to base chain Bitcoin. The fact that a Lightning wallet doesn't have to present the user with an interface about confirmations, which is completely unintelligible and annoying to an ordinary user. Consider that they don't have to start worrying about, well, what kind of CoinJoin facility do we add to this wallet? Because intrinsic to Lightning is it's not actually adding a transaction to the chain, at least if you're using it actively. I mean, if you don't use Lightning, then if you open a channel, you close a channel. That's not very interesting. Right, but if you use it 100 times, then none of those payments that you've made have gone to the chain. So I've been using Lightning to buy grocery gift cards, so buying food, and that's not recorded anywhere. I mean, it's true that the gift card payment was recorded, right? Because we're still like a step behind actually making payments in Bitcoin. There, we've still got this extra intermediary, but in principle, I'm making payments that are immediate. They're not recorded anywhere. Now you're going to say, or some people are going to say, oh, but the Lightning Network's privacy model is, dubious. There's all these academic papers about how you can de-anonymize this, and you can probe that, and you can follow these traces in the. All that's true, of course, in the same way as using TLS to encrypt your internet traffic is way a long way from perfect. But that doesn't mean it isn't good, and it isn't a hell of a lot better than doing the alternative, right? Right. Because the alternative is just broadcasting to the entire world every single transaction you do, paying dollars and dollars for it. That's the other aspect of the UX of Lightning that's so hugely superior, is that the whole problem of trying to figure out if the fee on your payment in Bitcoin is okay is just a nightmare. And it annoys me sometimes, and I consider myself more or less an expert. I go and like study some graph somewhere of, what's the current fee rate, because I don't really trust Bitcoin Core. I mean, no offense to Bitcoin Core's fee estimator, it's excellent. I'm sure it's the best out there, but the truth is there can't actually be an excellent fee estimator, because that's a prediction of the future. If you can predict the fees on Bitcoin tomorrow, then please, hook up to my Interactive Brokers account and start trading stocks for me, because you know the future, right? So basically, we can't predict fees, which means that there is no actual valid, smooth user experience for Bitcoin payments. And this, by the way, is why I got so annoyed with people in the early days, like Roger Ver and all those guys. Isn't it great? We can just, transactions are free, and it was absolutely rubbish. I mean, Bitcoin is Swift, not Starbucks point. I'll keep saying it. It's not like a gift card, right? It's like a very serious industrial connection layer. That's what it is, really, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't think you triggered anyone here by saying that, as far as I can tell. No,
it's cheap, isn't it, mentioning Roger? But I'm sorry, Roger. But the truth is, there's tons of other people who were the same back though. Then they were saying, "Oh, Bitcoin's so cool. I can go to the bar and I can scan a QR code." And well, yeah, you can, and it's fun. I don't deny it, and I've done it myself. It is a lot of fun, but it's a very limited consumer payments model. It doesn't really. It's not going to scale like that.
Right. Well, lots of work to do then. I mean, I guess maybe one thing before I open this to questions is kind of the role of blockchain analysis companies. Yeah, your hand is really stuck there. It doesn't look very comfortable to have your hand like this.
No, it's fine. My hand's way down here. You can't see it.
Yeah, I know.
That's not my actual hand.
So you have
those blockchain analysis,
Yeah, so you have those blockchain analysis companies, and today they have a lot of times a pretty easy job. But in the world like the world that you described, where people use all of those, consumers use the more consumer-oriented stuff, and people who are maybe more advanced will use, things like PayJoin and CoinSwap, and I guess Schnorr. They help make a lot of things look the same, right? And kind of remove. So they either add noise or they remove semantics, as you said. So do you think that in that kind of world you would have less analysis, or are we just gonna, or just this cat and mouse where they're gonna find their own new ways to track people again? Is there really a chance to kind of make their job really difficult?
Yeah, I don't know. I think my gut feeling is that whole side of things will remain. See, for example, I'm not. I don't really know. See, in a way, it's partly the same question as asking, should we move to confidential transactions? Should we have a model like Monero or even Zcash, where Bitcoin eventually morphs into something that essentially where that business model is impossible, right? Because that's the only option, isn't it? You're never going to stop those guys doing that unless it becomes impossible. Now, some people might say, well, if CoinJoin's well enough developed, and if CoinSwap is well enough developed, and if there's PayJoin, and give your list, whether Taproot makes everything harder and people add this new feature and that new feature, then maybe, and I kind of have made this argument myself, that the Schelling point kind of shifts, because at the moment the general perception is that everything is traceable, and so that it makes sense that people would have a business model where they would go to a law enforcement agency or some other important agency and say, look, we can provide all this tracing data for you, because the false positive rate is pretty low, because we make a bunch of assumptions, but actually most of the time those assumptions are correct.
Right.
So maybe in an optimistic version of the world, we could anticipate that enough of the activity on the base chain is being performed by sufficiently sophisticated actors, either because only the sophisticated actors are able to afford it and take part, or because a lot more people become sophisticated. So if it turns out that 80 to 90% of people participating in the base layer of Bitcoin are sophisticated actors that do use non-standard methods of transferring coins, then maybe blockchain analysis will become so unreliable that they can't sell it anymore, because like the false positive rate is like 80%. So people are saying, well, what the hell am I paying for? In the past, like for example, Andrew Polstra said this, and I've sort of parroted what he said several times, is blockchain analysis is snake oil. And I think, clearly you can see why it exists as a business model today, but you can equally clearly see why in some version of the future, the realities of the intrinsic fungibility of Bitcoin, which is, I use that phrase because I want people to understand that you can't actually trace individual. Not everything is watermarked, right? There is a actual intrinsic ambiguity in individual Bitcoin transactions, and that's not even thinking about the second layer or the whole kind of off-chain swap concept, breaking links. So just like intrinsically, I've said the same thing in different ways, but you get the general idea.
Yeah, I get it. So yeah, we'll see, I guess. But I mean, you know what? I think we'll open this to questions now. And I've seen that Peter kind of threw a hand emoji. If anyone wants to talk, click the raise hand button. It's on the right bottom of the screen, and then I can give you permission to speak. Otherwise, I just can't do it. So let's see. We have we have Peter. So go ahead. Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hey. Yep.
Hey.
Yep.
I just wanted to comment that I think it's important to consider what the business model of chain analysis companies actually is. And I think their goal is not to sell correct data. Their goal is to allow companies to meet regulatory checkmarks. And perhaps that regulation will eventually be influenced by how viable that business model is in the first place. But it being snake oil, I think, is true, and or at least can be true, but there's also not a very strong incentive for them to actually find the truth. They have to show we have done what we can.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, but I agree with what you're saying, but that's only part of the story.
It is, yes.
It's a very important part of the story, which I missed out. But so I'm glad you raised it. But they also might sell services, for example, the IRS or other law enforcement agencies.
This is true.
And there it's a little bit different.
This is true.
But what you're talking about is a very real effect too. When we have regulation, it adds this whole layer of inefficient crud. And the data is actually filtered through multiple layers. The truth is lost a long way away. Yeah, and I agree. It might take a long time. You're a very valid point. It might take a long time before there's any kind of shift in perception. Yeah.
That's really very interesting. That exchanges and services like that kind of have to say we really tried. We did our best. We did everything we could, and then they're kind of covered in many ways. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's see. We have merch. Go ahead.
Hey, I wanted to first say I think that Poloniex was bought by Circle in 2018, not 2017. February.
Yeah, I think that
makes sense.
Right.
Yeah. So I think.
Yeah, but I think in 2017. What was that? Sorry, I interrupted.
Sorry, I think the timeline of when it became hard for them to flush out of Poloniex with the thief taking their money out would have just not aligned completely. And then
I understand what you're saying. Oh
yeah,
go ahead.
That was just a small point, but if you want to comment.
No, I was just saying that I think the story's a bit more complicated, for example, with withdrawal limits and stuff. But anyway, I'm sure you're right. You are right about Circle. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then I kind of like the points you made around cryptographic assumptions and how it changes. But I think what can be stated very clearly and succinctly is Bitcoin already has some cryptographic assumptions, but they're fairly old and well tested, and it's very few of them. And while there are some cryptographic assumptions already, confidential transactions would add new ones that are not as well tested and are increasing the exposure to assumptions. Like,
increasing exposure, yeah.
Yeah. So it.
But
adds
it's highly debatable. Sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
Now, as I say, it's highly debatable whether it actually does add new cryptographic assumptions. Essentially, a Pedersen commitment relies on the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem hardness, which is exactly the same fundamental assumption in ECDSA. I mean, there's obviously a huge story around, the connection between the algorithm and the underlying cryptographic assumption. But the really interesting point is that it is essentially the same hardness assumption at base, but nevertheless, we see it differently, as you just correctly stated, yeah.
Yeah, and then I'm sure Peter could put this better, but with systems like Zcash, my understanding is that you have to make a trade-off whether you want perfect privacy or perfect accountability, and it's not trivial or it's impossible to get perfect on both, or separate them perfectly.
Correct.
Peter,
Yeah. No, that is correct. Yeah.
And so
yes, that's a fundamental
when you
logical
break one
point.
or the other, which one do you want to have broken? Do you want people to be able to go back and read the whole history of the network, or do you want them to be able to inflate the money supply? And if they inflate the money supply, that's surely the end of the value in that system. But if they can also break the whole privacy, that's going to end the system, very likely, and lose everybody their privacy. So it's sort of like there's multiple layers to that, and I agree with you that it's something that maybe not should be in the base layer, that is accountable, verifiable, and extremely simple. The biggest strength of Bitcoin is that it's so simple.
Yes, I absolutely agree. But I want to emphasize something, which is this point that is often discussed in the concept specifically of confidential transactions, and not Zcash, although I think it applies there too, is this as you say, that it's impossible, like at a logical level. I've written like a whole blog post about this if anyone's interested. It's impossible at a logical level to have both perfect hiding and perfect binding in a commitment scheme, and confidential transactions uses a commitment scheme in order to achieve this encryption of amounts. But what I find interesting is that even if you go to a binding version, let's say everyone agrees that we're just not prepared to allow an inflation to occur. So therefore, we prefer a perfect binding system where you can't commit to an amount and then use a different amount later. There's still assumptions there because of the encryption. And I'm not talking about the kind of assumptions that people write in like crypto papers. I'm just talking about the real world, messy, horrible crap, which is exactly what we saw in Zcash. What we saw in Zcash was something like this. Like somebody comes up with ZK snarks, and then it gets refined, and there's all kinds of different, and there's zero coin, and there's all kinds of papers. And at some point in one of the papers is written out a list of all the like parameters that have to be included in. You remember there's this whole trusted setup ceremony. And there's like one particular parameter that gets listed here that shouldn't have been listed there, and it ends up getting published. And the fact that it was public meant that anyone in the world could have printed an infinite number of, I think infinite, I'm not sure, but anyone in the world could have printed Zcash. And so that is a perfect example of the complete it's got nothing to do with like a mathematical model or whether you're using the correct definition of a binding commitment scheme or whatever. It's just somebody made a mistake, and it's also incredibly complicated that's. And as we discussed, the failure vector is the issue because it's encrypted. If it wasn't encrypted, if we're using cryptography for anything else, when you're using cryptography for signatures, then somebody might end up stealing all of your coins because your signature had a bad nonce value. This actually happens in the real world, right? Blockchain.info uses some stupid randomness in one of their nonces, and then a bunch of people get their coins stolen. That's horrible, but that's not the same thing as the whole system breaking and nobody knowing that the system broke. Sorry, I'm just ranting now. I seem to be just ranting. Sorry.
That's good. It's good. We all have rants. Let's see. I'll take a question from BTC Kitty. Go ahead.
Hi. Can you talk about some of the differences between JoinMarket and traditional Bitcoin mixers like Grams?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't even mention that. So that goes back a little bit further into Bitcoin history. We didn't really cover like the history of CoinJoin and all that stuff because that's kind of interesting. There was shared coin and dark wallet, but even before those, so you're going back like I guess 2011 was where it started. Certainly 2012, 2013, it was a thing. You had these, as you say, as you put it, traditional mixers like grams, and these were basically just a guy or a server, somebody running a server and saying, look, send me your coins. I will send you back the same number of coins minus some fee, but they won't be connected. And, you know, there was obviously a lot of, I vaguely remember reading, like, on forums, people arguing intensely about these mixing, these centralized mixers, but they weren't arguing about the thing that I thought they should be arguing about, which was, my God, are you mad just handing over all your coins? Because you just hand over your coins to these guys, and then sometime later they give them back. And of course, there's a certain pressure to make sure that it comes back reasonably quickly from a kind of a customer experience point of view, but there's a countermanding pressure, which is that you don't really want them to come back in the same minute, because then timing correlation makes it obvious it's the same coins, right? And so you've got to think about amount correlation and timing correlation, but fundamentally it's just a completely broken model, because the guy doesn't really have the incentive to give. I mean, yeah, you can make that old tired argument that, well, you know, he wants to keep in business, but like, he's anonymous on the internet. If you give him a big chunk of coins and then he doesn't give them back to you, you've got to convince the rest of the community that happened. So good luck with that. Anyway, I'm just blethering about it. I guess you already know about it, right? But otherwise you wouldn't have said grams.
Well, I just was curious about like the technical differences.
Okay, yeah, no. Oh, so the difference, sorry, my mistake. The difference is very, I think, concrete, which is with CoinJoin, everything that came from ShareCoin, Dark Wallet, JoinMarket, Wasabi, Samurai, these are all like CoinJoin systems. The difference is that all the participants, whether there's a server or not, all the participants don't have to trust each other with the money, right? So the basic idea is that when you and I make a CoinJoin together, we both put coins in and we both get coins out, but we don't have to put coins in first, then wait and hope the other guy behaves himself. What we do is we organize the transaction, we make a transaction, and we sign the whole thing as one. In other words, you sign the whole of the transaction. You see that your outputs are correct. I sign the whole of transaction because I see my outputs are correct. And because I only sign a transaction that pays me the right amount, I never have to trust you, and vice versa. And we can spread it out to 10 people, 20 people, 50 people, not just 2. And it's always trustless. Yeah.
Cool.
That's CoinJoin. That's what CoinJoin is, yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Let's see. We have a question from Alex. Alex, go ahead.
Hey, Alex.
I'm right over here. Yeah, thanks for the talk. You know, like, it's clear that CoinJoins became a bit more trendier in the late years, and it is more of a consumer product, at least. But out of my personal experience, to be honest with you, I prefer JoinMarket to the other ones, because even though it takes a bit to get used to, you know, at least you don't have to wait for things, and that's the biggest selling point for me. And for the other people who might want to CoinJoin is the same. How plausible is it to have a mobile client, or is it like something like, well, we're never going to have a mobile client because of these reasons?
I don't think it's impossible at all. I just find myself, when people ask about that kind of thing, I find myself just thinking about all the other things I'd want to fix first. And, you know, and also I'm not a mobile developer. I personally couldn't do it at all. So the first point is that somebody else has to do that. The second point is, you know, the back-end connection. Okay, the connection to Bitcoin Core is not really an issue. There's plenty of mobile wallets that have in some way or other solved that problem, so that's fine. But the encrypted connections over the multiple IRC service is going to be a bit tricky, and I'd rather we kind of fixed up that kind of janky aspect of JoinMarket first. I'd also like to completely have a new protocol, but that's kind of technical details. I mean, general principles, it's definitely possible. And I appreciate your point about you prefer it because you don't have to wait, which was the whole point of the design at the beginning. Absolutely, yeah.
I mean,
So
it's
like
easier
that.
to get,
which makes it fit for mobile.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes it a good fit,
Also.
kind of. But someone would have to build it, I guess.
Yeah, it's possible, but it's not a thing that exists at all at the moment as a plan, I'm afraid.
All right. Well, thanks for the answer.
Thanks.
Anyone could do it without asking you, though, right?
Also true, yeah, also true.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question from Andrew. Andrew, go ahead. Wait, I didn't click.
Can you hear me?
Oh, okay. Yep.
Hey. Yep, got you.
I had this probably better worded a few minutes ago before everyone else asked. Let me see if I can, do a good job asking. But my question is maybe a bigger picture, zooming out a bit, for a more general audience. A lot of people might say, "Why bother?" or "Why should I do this?" or "I'm just a casual user," or "I don't have large enough funds to be the target of attack." So I guess the question is two parts. Who is this for, and why should the general public use this? And also, is there a concern that a lot of people, especially on general podcasts and things, you really heavily promote coin joins and JoinMarket type activities for people that are really just stepping into this space, and it can sometimes be overwhelming. And is it even necessary, I guess? If there's nothing
those are
for
good
them
questions,
to,
I think.
quote unquote, hide or that type of activity.
Well, yeah. Before that last statement, I would have said that was a good set of questions, but I'm not sure about the last one. So generally, I'm not going to be specific to JoinMarket or even specific to CoinJoin. Just generally, an ordinary user, should they bother with any kind of privacy techniques? First of all, there's something that most people who would count themselves as ordinary users still have to deal with, which is they might have like a cold wallet. So you might want to think about using privacy techniques into and out of that. If just you probably don't want ideally other people to know like what your main stash is, so to speak. So that's something. However, just in a very kind of general, vague way, if you're a really casual user, if you're just experimenting, I would agree that it might be overkill if you just bought, let's say, $50 of Bitcoin on a phone and just to play around with it. It probably would be overkill initially to be thinking about privacy techniques, right? I would also say that the earlier discussion we had about Lightning very much fits in, that it's with that kind of thing, you just kind of intrinsically have a better privacy model anyway, even if you're being a very casual user. Your point about podcasts and other people promoting it heavily, I think it's valid to some extent. Like if people are fairly new to the space and they're trying to be like more serious, then at some point they might think about that. But maybe the first thing to think about is run a full node, because it isn't actually. A lot of people find it a bit scary to think about how to run a Bitcoin Core full node, but I think you should at least start with that, which, by the way, has its own significant privacy benefits, just doing that. So you could start with that, but certainly, once you get a little bit more kind of involved, then maybe CoinJoin should be at least part of the overall flow of what you do. It might, for example, be that you do CoinJoins, as I say, into or out of your cold wallet, or it might be that you do it or every month or two. You don't have to do it every day. You don't have to be crazy about it. Sure. I don't know. I'm just throwing out ideas here. There's different ways to look at it, I'm sure, but it's a good question.
Yeah,
I don't think you should say you've got nothing to hide though. That's kind of a
right. No, so just to clarify, that's generally the response from a lot of people who are introduced to these types of concepts, right? They say, "Why should I do this? I don't have anything to hide," and trying to get them to think about looking at the future or steps they can take to really set themselves up for protection now. It's a hard conversation to have with some people sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. The one thing that's really interesting here is kind of hard to explain, hard to explain to newbies. Is that you would want. I know a lot of people who tried Bitcoin years ago, and they only really realize how it works years later. And then they're kind of thinking, "Oh man, I wish I knew that 3 years ago because I made a lot of mistakes. Now everyone knows how many Bitcoins I have or whatever." And they're really unhappy about that. So you kind of have this tension. On one hand, it's kind of hard to explain, but on the other hand, this is the moment to understand it is probably around when you start,
as soon as possible.
And not after you made a ton of mistakes. So, yeah, it's hard. And I think MZ had something to say about that. So, I'll add just a minute. I'm having a difficulty finding the button. Okay, There I go.
Hello. Can you hear
Yep.
me? Yeah.
Yep.
Fine.
Perfect.
Yep.
I think I can add to that. The best is to have a simple example that you have in mind that what's actually the problem. So coming to the point, a good example is like you're doing something and get a donation. You have a donation address. It's on your website or maybe behind your under your YouTube video, whatever. And maybe you are open for the first step, like how much you get donated. That's maybe fine for you. But after that, you're using the funds and buying something, and that's open for the whole world what you are buying. And that's a good place where you should use CoinJoin or should use something that this connection isn't there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. That also reminds me of another point that I didn't quite get onto. This point about, the whole world can see what you're buying. I remember, I think it might have been in, where was it? Somewhere in South America anyway. And so Nick Szabo was on a panel and they were asking everyone about, isn't Bitcoin's privacy model not good enough, and he was saying, well, look, the pseudonymous model, of course, it's not perfect. We all know it's pseudonymous is not the same thing as anonymous, right? At least if we're in Bitcoin, we know that. But it's like, don't forget that the only reason it's a problem is because everyone's reporting all their identities to the government, especially on exchanges. I mean, we haven't mentioned exchanges that much, but exchanges are a huge problem in this because, if all we do is if all we do is gamble with Bitcoin, all we do is move money backwards and forwards between exchanges where we're registering identities, then the blockchain graph isn't even needed anymore. So, it could be like Zcash if that were all you were doing. It wouldn't make any difference. So don't forget that a big part of the privacy problem is exactly that we're tending to focus on using centralized services. And if we were making more peer-to-peer payments, if we were doing, and I think we should look for ways to, encourage Bitcoin economy to work. I mean, even if it's principally online, because it's very difficult to make physical local economies. It can happen occasionally. I've been in places where I've spent Bitcoin. It's cool when you get into like a bar and you can spend Bitcoin. Yeah. But it doesn't happen too much. So it tends to be an online economy. But if we can have more of that, it will drastically improve the privacy perspective. Although it's kind of a lofty goal, I admit.
Yeah, but I agree fully. Let's see. I'll take the last question from Mags. And I'm having trouble clicking the buttons for some reason. Okay.
Well, at least you've got a hand.
Should be now. Well, I'm not sure. Is she there? I'm not sure if she's here.
I think
she's
that's
kind of
Mags.
moving.
Yeah, I think so.
Sorry, I couldn't.
Okay.
Went to
Yeah,
sleep.
we heard now.
Went to sleep.
First thing, thank you.
I'll
for
try not to
telling
take that personally, Mags. But...
No, the hand went to sleep.
The hand went to sleep. Oh, okay. You didn't go to sleep. Okay.
No,
the controller.
Firstly, thank you for teaching us how to properly, wash coins and when we steal them.
Well, it was mostly how not to do that.
Yeah, we were mostly talking about how not to do it. Yeah.
To Peter's point a while ago, I don't think it's just about selling it to instead of tracing firms just selling it for law enforcement. They actually, I know OTC desks, for example, that use it, and probably exchanges to kind of flag.
Exchanges definitely use it very heavily.
Yeah. So they have things like certain addresses that have been flagged, and so you subscribe to this tracking service website, and they'll let you know, for example, how many hops something came from, and it's got a certain risk profile, so that they've got a big model. But one of my questions was a clarification, where I think you mentioned that maybe it was JoinMarket, where you said something about the people that are involved in the transaction can see a certain amount of data, and maybe I didn't get that right, but I'm thinking if I'm a tracing firm, maybe I want to get into that. Was that right?
Right. Yeah, first of all, it's JoinMarket that you're thinking of, which is the project that I maintain. Yeah, but the people taking part in it, seeing it, yeah? So essentially the idea is this, that in JoinMarket, this is specific to JoinMarket, but there'll be different discussions for other CoinJoin systems. that there'll be a typical situation might have 8 people taking the role of what we call maker. So those people are offering to do a coin join, and there'll be one person acting as what we call taker. So analogy with a market, yeah, acting as taker who wants to do a coin join, who instigates it, who says, here's the specific amount. Well, obviously I want to do it now. Here's the specific amount, and I want to do it with all of you people. And he chooses people at random from the set of people who are on offer. Now, the problem of, let's say, blockchain analysis firms taking part in such a coin join is obviously a meaningful issue. So one way it can be an issue is that because it's a market mechanism, a natural choice, let's say a Sybil attacker, we call that a Sybil attacker, somebody who's trying to take part with multiple versions and maybe run multiple bots, multiple wallets, whatever. What they might want to do is say, oh, I'm going to be a maker, but I'm going to offer a very low fee. And that way that when people come along and try to ask for 10 participants, they're mostly just going to choose me because I'm offering the lowest fees. So the way I specifically addressed that, although other people had similar ideas in the past. I said, 2-3 years ago, I said, what we really ought to do is make it so that there's a strong randomization in the choice. Now, it's still the case that a taker chooses like a maximum fee that they're willing to accept. But underneath that maximum fee, they were just going to choose completely randomly from the set. Okay. Now, that doesn't destroy the Sybil attack problem, but it does mean that if there are a lot of other participants, then the, in quotes, attacker, the guy who's trying to de-anonymize the mix, might only end up being, let's say, 2 out of that 8 instead of 8 out of that 8. And if he's only 2 out of that 8, he's reduced the anonymity set, that's true, but he's only reduced it somewhat, right? And the idea is, what's really interesting about JoinMarket that is kind of a very purist approach that you could argue is not very practical, but we say, everyone who participates over Tor connections. They don't, technically you can use ClearNet, but everyone uses Tor. And they don't offer any information about themselves at all. What they do commit to as takers is they commit a certain amount in a sort of cryptographic way. They commit a kind of token, which they then reveal when they take part in the transaction. And at the maker side, currently there isn't really enough of an anti-Sybil mechanism, which is why Chris Belcher's recently worked T-Bond wallets. So basically the idea there is that if you're going to take part on the maker side, you're going to commit some funds up front and lock them on the chain, time lock them. And it wouldn't stop, let's say, a blockchain analysis firm spinning up 1,000 possible participants, but they would have to commit a huge amount of funds on the blockchain in order to do so. So there's a couple of factors that might make it difficult for them, but it's a very good question and a very big question as well.
Yeah, no.
Sybil attacking joins.
Yeah, and then sort of follow on to that. So I know some exchanges have started implementing things like, okay, if you did a coin join from any kind of company, we're not accepting the coins, and I'm just wondering, because you're trying to do privacy, does it make more sense to use other privacy tools like Lightning, where you're not going to kind of face that? And I know that coin chain analysis firms might be trying to run their own nodes to try to get in between there as well, but just maybe your comment there.
Yeah, I think the reality is, as you say, that you're kind of running around, what's the word? Not chasing your own tail, but you're just going to you're constantly trying to move around. If the problem is that what they're trying to do is, in my opinion, largely unethical, maybe not entirely, but also fundamentally technically unworkable. Because if you started saying, well, I'm not going to accept coins that have been from a coin join, then somebody just does one hop from a coin join, or they do a coin swap, or as you say, they go through Lightning, or they just send their coins through some shitcoin exchange and they just get some other coins. Whatever. People are just going to. The point is that the technology doesn't fundamentally support this kind of deterministic tracing, and it never will. And so they're not going to succeed, but they are going to impose costs. And the worst thing about it is that the biggest costs they're going to impose are on ordinary people who just want to be reasonably private in their dealings. The people who are serious criminals will easily get around this stuff.
Thank you.
The only way they're succeeding at all is, I'll tell you how they're succeeding today. It's because they have this horrible kind of incestuous relationship, with, as far I can tell, with every exchange, where the exchanges give them like connecting information, and they just kind of use the blockchain to make fairly trivial connections between those IDs, and that's what's so kind of horrible about it. I just think it's all just deeply wrong, but I understand why it happens. I mean, it was easy to predict this coming. I think many people did predict these firms coming, like from 2012, 2013 onwards, or even earlier. It was easy to see it was going to happen because, regulatory agencies, law enforcement agencies are going to put the screws on and force anybody acting as a company in a public company to, and after all, it depends on what your perspective of finance is generally. I think things like FATCA and so on are just a complete travesty of all kinds of ethics. If you probably don't agree, so I'll just stop ranting.
Well, thanks, Mags. And I see Merch is very enthusiastic to say something, so let's do it. But let's try to keep it short because we're running out of time and we'll be kicked out soon.
Yeah. Waxwing, you said that exchanges and chain analysis companies are basically incestuous and gonna make the Bitcoin privacy very low. How about having accounts in multiple not cooperating jurisdictions and going that way? Like if I have an exchange in China that I have an account on and one in the US, and would that help me, do you think, or do the chain analysis companies combine those data sets?
Well, you mentioned, that's really interesting. You mentioned China. If you'd said anything else, I mean, the way that US financial regulation has basically strangled the entire world. I mean, it's killed privacy in Swiss banking, for example. It's made it impossible for American expats to even operate normally. And all the so-called tax havens and so on. I mean, you can debate all you like about that, but that stuff, basically they just control it all. But of course, when it comes to very big adversarial geopolitical adversaries like Russia or China, especially China, it is a more complicated picture, and I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you should ask some Chinese people. They might have. It's a very interesting point you make. If you were straddling two very genuinely different financial jurisdictions, it might be significant. Yeah, I don't know if there's data sharing between Chinese finance officials and American. I don't know. Yeah.
Thanks.
Right. Okay. Thanks. I think that with that we can kind of end this. I really enjoyed this, Adam. So thank you for joining us. This was awesome. I really enjoyed this talk.
Thank you. So did I. Yeah, thanks.
And thanks for everyone who showed up too. I also want to thank Kraken for supporting these. Yeah, you only have one hand to. We have Johnny who's kind of throwing a lot of emojis
I'm
everywhere.
disadvantaged. Yeah. I'm disabled.
And also want to thank Andrew and Ben and CQ who were helping with moderating here today. And again, don't forget you can sign up on recklessvr.com to get invites to these meetups every week. And we're also reckless_VR on Twitter. And I guess in about 20 minutes, we're going to do a VR chat after party. Are you going to be there, Waxwing, Adam?
I'll
VR chat?
so, yeah. Yeah,
okay, that's good. That's good. So, I'll do that in about 20 minutes. And until then, anyone who wants can stay here or take a break. And that's it. That's it. Thanks again, Adam. This was great.
Bye. Thanks. Bye-bye.
And let's see.
Oh.
And that's it. You can speak now.
What's that question mark? What's that question mark under your chair? Udi?
Oops, sorry, I was muted.
Are you there, Udi? It's all right. What do?
So it's like you click it and you get some instructions. I guess they put it here in the room.
Hello.
I can't click it.
Click it like
Well.
with your musical button.
Wait, so
It's not very exciting. Like you'll be disappointed.
Oh yeah.
On
I
Twitter,
played.
Okay.
I said I'm gonna start posting more
What do you
because
mean
I just
get
played too much
kicked
for
out?
myself, so it's good to get
No,
other
it
people's
was a
input
joke.
and stuff.
I was a
Okay.
little bit shocked that the banana.
No, I don't think people guys like
I was
it.
wondering.
I just didn't want to
Yeah, always
hold
picture you
people
as a
for too
banana.
long, you know?
Yes,
Just stick to the schedule.
People will get kicked out in their
Yeah,
home.
that's fair enough.
In their home, yeah, exactly.
Oh, awesome.
Kicked out of the chair.
Did I offend? Did I offend Mags? She disappeared after I started ranting about Fatka.
Sounds like she was having some technical difficulties.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I don't think she did. I don't think she was offended. I was a bit worried. Oh yeah. Let's say you're a bad actor. Let's let's say.
Oh no.
Oh, she's disappeared.
What?
Oh my god.
And I joined our